All right, welcome back to the discussion on The Shining, the book and the film. This is a continuation of the discussion of the book. Now, we've already run through the Masque of the Red Death. We're still continuing our discussion on the book, and eventually I will get to the film. I don't know how long that's going to take. Hopefully it won't be too long. These are free-flowing discussions. I have basic ideas I write down, and hopefully the method doesn't bother you too much. It's the most honest way I can think of presenting this material. Now, if you want to watch previous episodes, I do suggest you do so. At the very least, you should have watched the film before you watch these episodes that I've made discussing these topics. I'll have them in the description, and they're also in a playlist on my channel if you want to check that out. And that playlist is basically called, Why is The Shining the Greatest American Book Film Ever Made? So I want to go through a number of things today. First, I want to do comments and corrections, and that's going to be fairly extensive today. The second part, I want to discuss 2 chapters of the book, and we're going to see some issues of significance that are going to kind of verify things that we've been discussing already. So because that verification is happening, I think it's possible to make some conclusions and some assessments, and so I want to do that. This episode is going to be pretty important. I'm going to go through some very big ideas, and hopefully it's enjoyable if you like big ideas or if you just enjoy the material. And the third thing I want to do then is I want to look at a very specific scene in the film and look at it from 3 different points of view. And we'll kind of consider what may be developed there and whether or not that's on purpose. Why is it that, these 3 different points of view seem to work on this scene? And is that being done deliberately? And if so, then, in my opinion, that's very significant. It's an indication of collective genius in the film. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started then with comments and corrections. Not very many people gave me any comments or corrections, so I'm going to self-correct. Because I know I'm making mistakes and I'm missing things as I go through here. And it's not easy to, put together a really thoughtful review of micro data, I guess you would call it. I don't know exactly what I'm doing. I don't know what to call this. Let's take a look at a few ideas. The first is that we discussed the possibility that the Masque of the Red Death and its discussion of the onset of the disease and passing being only 30 minutes is very similar to atomic warfare. Now, there are various rocket/nuke references, and of course, there's the bunker itself in the film that feel very much like a warning against nuclear war. And there is something in the book that I missed. It's on page 19. Now, again, I'm using this paperback, softcover, 78 reprint of The Shining, and it has the black and chrome cover. On the bottom of page 19, very specifically is stated by Watson as he's showing Jack Torrance around the work that he needs to be doing in the future. They get to the boiler. And one of the things he mentions is that it's sooner or later that it's going to blow. And it's going to blow the whole place sky high. And he hopes that Ullman, who he refers to as like a fat piece of crap, he hopes that he's there to ride the rocket very specifically. Now, that's funny for a number of reasons. I guess it's not funny, but it's strange for a number of reasons. Not least of which is, of course, that Kubrick had already made Dr. Strangelove, where someone is shown riding not a rocket, but a bomb, as it's being dropped from a bomber. So that's a little bit funny. You'd have to wonder, did Kubrick see that and kind of have a little chuckle? Is that part of the reason why he decided to, develop this into a film? I don't know, but it is noteworthy that that idea of swift death is encapsulated within the short story Masque of the Red Death. It's here in Stephen King's novel. I missed it. I thought that perhaps the writers or producers associated with the film had picked up on the earlier discussion, but it's here in the book as well. So Stephen King also has included that same idea. So the second thing that I'd kind of like to correct is this idea of mental illness. Now, this is a kind of a tough one. This is an exaggerated story dealing with mental illness, and we assume it's mental illness, and it's not someone that's just being possessed by spirits. I mean, there's two different ways of looking at this, and some people do argue that this is entirely a psychological review. And I'm not a psychologist, and I'm not well versed in psychology, so I'm not a real good resource for this, in my opinion. But I do know some basic things that perhaps are psychological ideas. So, why am I bringing that up? Because I'm going to review some psychological topics today, but also because mental illness and the traits of certain identifications, like let's say someone is schizophrenic or they have psychopathy. Most people have certain traits or certain aspects of these things. The question is always in what amount. In what amount do they exist? The amount of these things existing in Jack Torrance is quite obvious. It's obvious in the way that he mugs for the camera throughout the film. He's behaving in a very exaggerated fashion, and we would have to say that the likeliness that he's doing so is to prove that he is an extreme outlier of these characteristics is, in my opinion, quite likely. So that's being done on purpose. But one of the things that I mentioned, one of the things that's important in a film or any work of art is that you incorporate aspects of it into yourself. So I do think that perhaps he's showing us, as I said, how not to be through the film, how not to behave, why not to behave that way. And perhaps the mugging through the film, the mugging is where you kind of make a face for a camera, that he's doing is being done on purpose for that reason. Not only to make us realize that we have a connection to him, but also that some of the behaviors that he's showing, we need to recognize in ourselves. And for that reason, we have a connection to the film, we have a connection to the character, and we have a connection to the actions and attributes of Jack Torrance. And we shouldn't, because he's not a good guy. So that self-review, I think, is important. And perhaps by him behaving in such an exaggerated fashion, that's what's intended. I don't know. I'm just going to throw that idea out there. So anyway, I don't want to be flippant about this topic because mental illness is a very, very serious topic. I think it's a very important topic for the entire country, my country, United States, right now. The impact of the dynamic of social media and so many other things, I think, is impacting people's mental health in such a negative way. And perhaps that's what's being discussed here. And I'll bring up a third point, which is product placement. So we somewhat discussed product placement before. We're going to discuss it again today. So what is the reason for including that product placement? Well, we have two references to media. One in this book. One is, of course, the products that are being placed. And it's quite possible, I don't know, that maybe Mr. King made a side deal with these companies to mention them in his book. And in doing so, then he got a reward somehow. Maybe it's in a contract. Maybe there's some commercial thing going on there. Obviously, in film, by placing products, you can get paid. So perhaps by placing them in his books, he's getting paid. I don't know. I don't know if something like that is done. But it also is quite possible that because he's making references to cartoons, he's making reference to a process, to a system. And that system is very similar to the idea of what came first, the chicken or the egg. What is really the driving force here? And in a similar way to the idea of something being born, living, dying, and then being reborn, as we mentioned, with the numbers that are specifically called out by Mr. King in this novel already. Is the product placement / cartoon aspect being discussed as a process to kind of make us consider what is really driving what, and what are the implications of this process. What is the impact upon the people that are viewing this process? I don't really know if that's what's happening, but I do wonder if that dynamic isn't being discussed on some level by Mr. King. Okay, so here's another idea that I kind of wanted to discuss or comment on at any rate. And we already kind of discussed psychology. So let's consider something really quickly that I didn't recognize until a few days ago. And this is kind of shown in the beginning of the drive up to the Overlook, when the family is kind of driving up there, and they're in the Volkswagen, and Danny comments not only on how pretty his mother looks in her blue dress, but also that she looks pretty young, and Jack Torrance is attracted to her, and she keeps kind of having to, push his hand away because he's constantly trying to touch her legs and stuff. So this is on page 61. Now, I don't know for sure that this is happening, okay? But there are certain ideas that have already been presented that are of psychology nature. And I don't know if anyone's done a thorough review of this I assume someone has done a review of this from a psychological point of view. We don't know really what's happening with the family. If you watch the film, you assume that there are ghosts, and you assume that the place is haunted, and you assume that it's making these problems for these people. But we have to wonder, because these people do have issues that are discussed already. We've already discussed many of these issues, whether or not they are the source of the problem, and they're simply psychologically dealing with issues that they have. So one of the things that you notice from this pretty blue dress thing is that Danny idolizes and is attracted to his mother. Yeah. And some of you already know where I'm going with this. But the story of Oedipus is part of the Oedipal complex that's discussed by Freud. And of course, Oedipus, the story of Oedipus is that he kind of unwittingly kills his own father and marries his mother. And this can be shown, of course, because Danny leads his father through the maze to try and escape from his father. I don't know that it's intended that he's going to have his father die, or if he just wants to escape from his father. It's different. The ending is different, of course, from the book. We'll find out. But he does unwittingly kill his own father in this film. And he does, in a way, marry his mother. And this is shown specifically in the scene where she's walking with him through the maze. And in a way, you have to wonder if Jack is kind of watching on. Jack Torrance is watching them kind of walk through the maze, through the model there. And he's being lit. And part of the reason that he might be lit is he's recognizing perhaps that he's being replaced by his son. Just a thought that I had, and something that perhaps might intrigue you, that there might be a reference to an Oedipal complex happening there. And the reason why I say, again, that this might be happening, that there are psychological kind of points of view being presented in the film, is because of the constant reference to shadows around Jack Torrance. Now, the shadow is, of course, something that's thoroughly examined by Carl Jung. That's one of his big ideas. The idea that people have issues that are repressed, that they consider to be undesirable, either undesirable to them or undesirable to society at large, that they just kind of don't want to deal with. So they push it aside and they don't deal with it. Now, as Jung noticed, the more that you ignore these problems, the worse they can get, until they can consume you. And in many ways, that's kind of what's happening to Jack. And we notice in the book already, like when he's at the bar, that shadows seem to be around him. There's a chapter 4 titled Shadowland. So Jack seems to be unable to deal with the shadows that are around him. And he doesn't want to self-review. So he's perhaps not dealing with that already. Now, we're going to see or confirm this when we read through the section of book today, the section of this book that I want to read through. And we'll get to that here in just a moment. So this is pretty big, and perhaps there is a very large psychological discussion happening within this book, and perhaps it's being relayed in the dynamic that we just discussed. This idea of product placement and television and commercialization and its impact on families. Of course, we know already that Danny likes Looney Tunes and he likes Bugs Bunny. I mean, that's why he's called Doc. So how much time has he spent with his family? How much time has his family spent with him? Where's the connection? Is that something that's being discussed? The break in the family tied to media, which is a big issue now with social media. And how families used to be, where, I mean, really the only entertainment you had was in talking with one another or working, working outside or working on things. So perhaps that's being discussed. I don't know. Let's consider the animals. This will be the last one I want to kind of discuss in comments before we get started. Okay, so previously I didn't discuss them. It was too complex. It was going to take too much time and effort. And as usual, okay, that's one of the excuses people make when they're dealing with their own shadow. They say, oh, this is too complex. It's going to be too much work. I don't want to have to deal with it. And so I did exactly the same thing with the hedge animals that are discussed in Stephen King's book. But I'm not going to do that. I'm going to tackle it. Let's take a look at it. And I'll try to make it kind of simple. Okay? Now, as we mentioned, there are the 5 animals that are talked about in the book. There's 3 lions, there's a rabbit, there's a dog, there's a cow, and there's a horse. These do not seem to be related to each other in any way, in my opinion. Not least of which is the fact that they're quite different. And I guess you could say that dogs, cows, and horses are domestic, but rabbits and lions, why, that doesn't even make sense. I don't really get it on its surface. But let's take a look at this, at these symbols from different points of view, okay? And what might be referenced. First, I want to look at it from a Christian point of view, a traditional Christian point of view. Lions, of course, can be associated with the sun. It's a solar symbol. We already discussed that. It's a very complicated symbol because it can also be an evil symbol because lions are destructive animals. They can kill people. But, of course, in Revelations 5:5, I believe, Revelations discusses the Lion of Judah. This is a reference directly to Christ or Jesus. So we have a reference from a solar point of view, referencing, which is light, which is important because that's kind of what we're discussing here in The Shining, right? That's why all the strange lights is happening. That's why it's in the Masque of the Red Death. And here we have a solar symbol associated with Christ, and it's one of the hedgerow animals. Coincidence? I don't know, maybe. There are 3 of them. Why are there 3 of them? It is possible, of course, that we're dealing with 3 aspects of God. So it could be a reference to the Trinity, right? There's number 3. It could be a reference to the Trinity. There are 3-faced gods that have been historically studied. And if you are aware of Gnostic teaching, you know that there is, I don't know what you would call it, the god idea of Baphomet, which was tied to groups like the Templars. And I'll kind of give you a picture of Baphomet. And the most famous illustration is of course, by Eliphas Levi. At any rate, this symbol, someone else has already tied to the photo at the end of the film when Jack Torrance is lifting one arm and lowering the other arm. He's obviously taking the same pose. Why is he doing so? Well, most traditional Christians would say, well, this is because this is a symbol of Satan. And as such, Jack Torrance is similar to Satan, which is funny because in the film, he's frozen at the end of the film. And in Dante's Inferno, Satan is frozen. He's in a frozen lake in the ninth circle of hell. So perhaps that's why Jack Torrance is frozen at the end of the film, because he is a representation or a representative of Satan or evil, and as such, he becomes frozen and trapped the same way that Satan was in the frozen layers of hell. Okay, so and again, now Gnostics may not have the same point of view when it comes to this symbol. We should recognize also, by the way, that through William Blake's work depicting Satan in this story of Satan being frozen in hell, that he draws him with three heads. So this idea of being three-headed, I don't totally understand, but it's tied up in. I mean, you can understand why the positive aspect of God might be three-headed. It's called out in the Trinity. But why would Satan have three heads? I don't totally get it. Perhaps it's a reflection, an inverse reflection of what is considered to be God up above. So God up above is a Trinity. So there's perhaps an evil Trinity of some sort that's tied to Satan. What that evil Trinity would be, I don't know. There are three evil people associated with the hotel that are represented in the book. So we have not met the bartender yet, but he's in the film. Omen is clearly evil in the book, although it's not very clear in the film. And third, of course, is the character Grady, who also appears to be evil. So there are the three aspects of evil, the number three, in the book tied to evil. And perhaps they're the three heads of Satan. I don't know. You decide what you think. Anyway, I've gone off topic. The next symbol is rabbit, and it's tied, of course, through Christian teaching to Easter. Now, this also was a pagan symbol and was also used to designate rebirth or resurrection, of course. This is a reason why it was placed on gravestones, because it was tied to spring and being reborn. The next symbol, dogs. Dogs usually represent faithfulness, and dogs generally represent faithfulness. They also can be tied to healing. They also are considered to be guardians. So why is a dog a Christian symbol? Well, I don't really know. I mean, I'm sure dogs are called out quite frequently in the Bible. However, as Mr. Crowley noted, dog is always connected to God simply through the letters. So the inverse of dog is God. And we know already that Stephen King is considering this because he's doing exactly the same thing with red rum and murder. He's inverting the letters, which is something that's pretty commonly done by Crowley, to invert words and see kind of what they look like, and call to one another as like reflections. In the same way that we've discussed that we have reflections in mirrors of images, we can have reflections of ideas in words by reversing the letters. Okay. Cow now is fairly, from this point of view, fairly obvious. There is a worshiping of cows. There's the golden calf that made Moses so angry, and it's tied to material wealth. There also is a red cow, a sacrificial red cow that's mentioned in the book of Numbers. And of course, we already discussed the nature of the bronze bull from the Masque of the Red Death, the apparent allusions to it in the Masque of the Red Death, and of course that Greek story of people being sacrificed or killed in a bronze bull. Finally, horses, and of course these can be tied to a revelation. Again, they're often associated with war. In particular, the horses can represent violence, famine, plague, and death. And these are the riders, the horsemen of the apocalypse, that are called out in Revelation. So we have a certain number of ideas here. We have Christian references to rebirth. We have, which is tied to a cycle. We have Materialism, which we've already discussed, is being shown in room 237, and of course in the film is also shown in the Gold Room. And we have this idea of apocalyptic destruction, which of course is tied to the horse from a Christian point of view through Revelations. Okay, so that's those symbols, as far as I can tell. One of the interesting aspects of dogs is the Dominican order, which is called Dominicanus, which is very, very similar, if you do it in Latin, Dominicanus, which is very similar to Domini Canis, which means the god of the God's dog, or the dog of God, Domini Canis. So perhaps something going on there. I don't know. Just messing around with words. So let's look then at these things from what I consider to be a mythological or a pagan point of view, and in particular from an Egyptian/Greek point of view. Many of these are direct references to gods. Let's see what they represent. The first one is dogs. I'll take a look at dogs first. Basically, dogs are pretty easy. They're tied to Anubis, and as they are tied to Anubis, they also are representatives of the underworld, because Anubis is tied to the underworld. And of course, we have to also recognize that in Greek mythology, Cerberus, which is a dog, a guardian dog, is there to guard people from entering hell and to keep people that are in hell, or Hades, as the Greeks called it, from leaving. Now, one of the most important stories regarding Cerberus is, of course, that Heracles, or Hercules, goes down and takes Cerberus from hell, or he takes him from Hades and brings him back up into the world. So in this way, Hercules overcomes Hades. He overcomes the power of death. He overcomes the power of the underworld, the Shadowlands. And so Hercules, in many ways, who wears, by the way, the skin of a lion, a solar symbol, goes down into Hades, and as we've already discussed with Castor and Pollux, returns from the dead. So that idea is consistent. And we'll get into Hercules and Cerberus a little bit more later on. Of course, Hercules' weapon, which I did not understand when I was young, but now I understand. His weapon was a club. And we've already discussed the nature of the club, because in this story by Mr. King is the roque mallet, which is being used to kind of terrorize Danny. Already in his visions, he's seeing this roque mallet. And of course, Hercules uses a club. And why does Hercules use a club? Because it's an indicator of pure, true strength. And as an indicator of pure, true masculine strength, it's beautiful. How so? Well, the idea of strength is tied to many things, but through true strength, Hercules is able to accomplish many of his labors. So, of course, getting Cerberus is the 12th labor. But a man in his prime is really when he's strong. And he's not just strong with hitting things with a club. It's also when he's like resistant to disease. It's also when he's most attractive to the opposite sex. We have these ideas of beauty, strength, and fertility, and all of these ideas that are kind of packed together within this idea of Hercules and his club. The club also is fairly bloodless, so in a way, there are traditions, cultural traditions, where it was considered to be more appropriate to kill things without bloodletting. Now, I won't get into that too much, but especially amongst royals, I believe the Ottomans had this tradition that the princes, when it was time to ascend, had to fight to see who was going to become the leader of the Ottoman Empire. And in order to do so, the tradition was that you had to get rid of your brothers, basically. And the way that you had to do that was without shedding blood. Because I guess that's a noble thing to do. I don't know. Anyway, again, side topic. Okay, so the lion. We've already discussed the lion somewhat. We already discussed it's a solar symbol. And of course, it's tied to Sekhmet in the Egyptian mythology. So Sekhmet is a solar warrior and is associated with destruction and disease. Interesting, isn't it? 3 lions. So we have a significant tie there to the idea of destruction and disease and being a warrior within the goddess Sekhmet. Okay? The cow symbol was very important to the Egyptians. It's tied to Hathor and is tied to the ideas of fertility and, of course, intercourse. The horse is represented by Reshef and is tied to war and plague. Again, there's a reference to horses being tied to war and plague, as is identified by the Book of Revelations. It's in concert with Egyptian mythology. And finally, we have the rabbit, which is tied to Wenet in Egyptian mythology, and again is tied to rebirth, quite convenient, and also has a strange connection to snakes. And I didn't mention before, but the dog Cerberus also has connection to snakes. Apparently there were snakes on it in various areas, and sometimes Cerberus also is represented with 3 heads or 2 heads or just 1, but also has a connection to snakes. Now, we don't have snakes referenced here, but if you've read the book already, you know that there is a reference to snakes in the book. Okay? We haven't gotten to it yet, but we will. And that'll be significant, and I'll discuss it when we get to it. So let's go ahead and get started then with Chapter 10 on page 71. This will start to introduce the important character of Dick Halloran. Okay? And not only, because he's the cook and he shows them around the kitchen, but also because he becomes a guide of sorts to Danny Torrance. So one of the first things I want to point out is at the top of the page here, on page 71, we find out that he doesn't correlate with what Wendy Torrance thinks is an appropriate chef for such a high establishment. So she has, again, a kind of predisposition towards what she thinks is appropriate for a place like this. And certainly having someone that is a cook, a simple cook, who is a black man, is not in line with her idea of how someone should be a chef, which would she specifically kind of calls out as being kind of a pasty-faced Frenchman. That's what she thinks of a chef should look like at a place like this. Now, that could be a very small thing, but I just want to point out, I believe that the main character of this story is actually Wendy. And I believe the main character of the film is Wendy. Now, it's easy to see why people would say that it's Danny Torrance or Jack Torrance, but I believe that actually the main character is Wendy. Okay? Funny that people complain about lead characters being women now, but I can name 2 films that have lead characters as women that were, I can name 3 that were wildly popular. 3 of the most important films ever made, and made quite a bit of money. 4. I can name 4. So there's this book and film, which didn't make a lot of money, but which I think will stand the test of time as one of the greatest films ever made. The Wizard of Oz, obviously. Lead character is female. Correct? Wildly popular. Titanic, wildly popular, made a lot of money. Lead character is female. And the final one, Gone with the Wind. One of the most important films ever made, extremely financially viable, and lead character is a woman. So it's a little bit strange to me that people complain that films are being made that are not doing well, that have lead characters as women. Certainly there are good films and bad films. But I believe the lead character in this story is Wendy Torrance. Okay, so it's a little bit odd again now here. So this is a bit of development, in my opinion. She is learning about the world. She's a naive character. In a way, she's very similar to Dorothy from The Wizard of Oz. She's learning about the nature of the world. She's seeing things, and this will be important because that's what happens to her in the film. She begins to see things as they are. The next is on same page, about halfway down, again, there's product placement about Sears and Roebuck dentures. I discussed that already, so there's an example of more product placement. And that doesn't even get into the food yet that's discussed. The next point is confirmed on page 72 at the top of the page that Dick Hallorann is going to go to Miami for a vacation during the winter. And that's what he does in the film. That confirms the film. The next point is about halfway down. He specifically states that he'll be glad to see the last of him, meaning Ullman. Now this confirms what Watson says, that nobody likes Ullman, and is contrary to the film, where everybody's waving to Ullman and he gets along well. But in the book, he's almost universally despised. So you have to ask the question, why is Kennedy being used as a symbolic kind of an icon? And I guess I'll get into that a little bit later. There'll be something that comes up later in the book that will perhaps explain why that is already. Of course, we already have a discussion of nukes and atomic warfare, and that's tied to Kennedy because of Cuba, the Cuba crisis. So perhaps that's why he was chosen. But I think it's much deeper than that, and I'll explain why later. Not in this episode, but later. Okay. The next point that I would like to kind of make is that the whole family is kind of walking through all of these things together. Jack and Danny are walking with Wendy as she's kind of being shown around. We'll see that throughout this kind of tour, Danny is with them the whole time. So in the film, Danny gets lost or is just kind of left out, and that's the first time he sees the twins, and then he's brought back to them when they're in the gold room. That doesn't happen in this book. That's a variation from the book. Why does that happen? I'm not really sure. It may simply just be an indication of Jack and Wendy again not being mindful parents. On page 72, about 2/3 of the way down, we have a reference to Wendy stating that she's confused by the layout, and she specifically says that she's going to have to leave a trail of breadcrumbs to find her way around. This is an obvious connection to the idea of the labyrinth and the maze. And as we mentioned, the layout is a little bit strange. And of course, in the Masque of the Red Death, the layout of the Prince's Palace is stated to be a little bit strange. So that idea of the strange layout is continued here in the book, and it is represented in the maze of the film. And she's specifically calling out here in the kitchen. Okay. The next point I would like to make is that on page 73, Wendy makes a reference to the Donner Party again. Okay, so she again, this is totally internal to her, is considering the nature of the Donner Party. Why is she continually fixating on the Donner Party? Well, I mean, she just may be a very anxious person, but we assume, of course, or at least I do, that she's somewhat mentally unstable. So maybe she's perhaps mentally unstable, but perhaps she's also shining, and we'll discuss this later with Danny here when he talks with Mr. Hallorann. But perhaps she also is shining. How is she shining? Well, the Donner Party was a group of, they really were families that were traveling together to the west. They got trapped in the snow, and they turned on one another. And that's kind of what happens here in the book. So she may be having foreboding fears or even visions or thoughts tied to what's going to go wrong in the future. She might see it happening already. So that can happen on a subconscious level. Some people just, they get the willies, they get weirded out by things. They start thinking about things that can go wrong. And from my point of view, yeah, you should listen to that voice. I mean, sometimes that nervousness is valid, and sometimes it's not. Later on, Mr. Hallorann will relay a story, and I think it's quite applicable. Okay, so let's take a look. The next point I would like to kind of, I guess let's make a reference to a joke here at the top of the same page on 73, that Wendy kind of mentions that she's just going to throw TV dinners into each of the stoves. So she's a bad cook, and this has already been kind of discussed in the film when it's shown that she's not really putting much effort into breakfast with Danny. But later in the film, she's actually cooking regular breakfast, eggs and bacon and toast and all these things. Again, development of a character. She's developing as a motherly figure. And we'll find out she's developing not only as a motherly figure, but also as a fatherly figure. Okay, page 74. Here we have a reference to Wendy's concern that Danny might swallow his tongue in an epileptic seizure, and they'll be stuck out there. Again, she's having fears and concerns. Is that a valid fear and concern? Well, if you have a child with a chronic condition, yeah, that's entirely valid. So although you could say she's being anxious or whatever else, I would say that that's simply being a parent, and a good parent that's concerned about the health and well-being of your own children. And she's denying herself here in the italics, in parentheses. She says, what if we have a wonderful time and everything's great, right? So stop worrying, right? This is the process of ignoring the shadow. This is the shadow process right here that's being called out if you're into that idea, the psychology of it. The idea that there are things, thoughts, or aspects of yourself that you do not like, that you don't want to deal with, so you argue with yourself and you repress them. Now we know already that she has engaged in this process because she has made excuses for her husband's violent behavior, not just with Danny, but in general with herself, that things maybe could be okay. She's delayed getting divorced from this abusive man because she's hoping and not facing reality. Okay? Not judging now, just saying that this is the process, and it's a difficult process. And people that want to deal with the negativity in their life that's generated by other people or by people that they love or even caused by themselves is difficult to review and difficult to challenge and change. And she's going through that process here. It's clearly shown that she's battling internally, mentally with these things. She's the only one doing this that we can note. Jack is fighting with alcohol, but he's not really dealing with what I would consider to be an equal level of secondary review. He just knows that he's going to be punished if he gets back into alcohol. But is he really reviewing what's the process that's kind of led to it and throughout his life? I don't know. I don't get that vibe. Okay. So, important, very important point here, middle of page 74. Halloran asks Danny, "Do you like lamb, Doc?" Okay, now in the movie, he doesn't ask this. He asks it while he's shining. He asks it telepathically, mentally. But here, he just asks it normally. Okay? We just went through all these images. We went through all these symbols. Here is a reference to lamb and tied to Danny. So this idea of shining, everything else, the Lamb of God is a reference directly to Christ. So in a way, are we supposed to assume that Danny is Christ-like? If you're looking at this from a Christian point of view, is Danny Christ-like? Is he like the third aspect of God in some way? I don't know. Or is it just a reference to lamb to make us think of Christ and the salvation of Christ? I don't know. But it's clear that a number of Christian symbols are being deliberately used because there's been so many of them here. The family is kind of surprised that Mr. Halloran knows that he's called Doc because they haven't really said that, and they distinctly mentioned Bugs Bunny cartoons. Okay? So he says, "Oh, okay, I didn't really know," but he knows. Bottom of page 74, in italics, Mr. Halloran sends Danny a telepathic message and asks him if he's sure he doesn't want to go to Florida. So right there, instead of saying, "Do you want some ice cream?" Okay, so let's consider the nature of that. Someone's having fun with words, okay? The reason someone's having fun with words, in my opinion, is because ice scream is similar to Dick Halloran. Okay, you have an object that's doing something kind of wild. Eyes are screaming. Do you want some ice cream? And a dick that's hollering. Hollering like yelling. Okay? So is that the reason why ice cream is mentioned? Because in the book here, it's not ice cream at all. It's lamb. So why was that changed? If you read the book, you would recognize that there's a variation there, that there's a change that's happened in the script. Who's doing that and why? And of course, this could all be a reference to, these could all be phallic references. Okay? Dick Halloran. We've seen a number of other phallic references here already, like the Roque mallet. Okay, let's continue on. On page 75, he says specifically that he knows that Mr. Halloran, he says, Dick to your friends. And Mr. Halloran says, yep, and since you're a friend, then you can call me Dick. Okay, so Danny knows things about Mr. Halloran, and Mr. Halloran knows things about Danny instinctively, intuitively, and indicating that they both are capable of shining. And, of course, this is part of the reason why Danny feels a connection. This connection between Danny and Mr. Halloran is going to be very important to understand something that happens later in the film. Okay? It happens to some degree, it happens in the book, and it's not shown in the film, but there are aspects of it that are continued in the film that people have misinterpreted, in my opinion. Page 76. There's a globe and chain light, kind of a strange old-fashioned light that's hung in the pantry. Here again is reference to the strange lighting that's called out in the short story Masque of the Red Death. It's continued and represented here in the novel. On page 77, we find out the history of previous caretakers, how many of them have been financially ruined. One of them had 2 boys, and one of the boys was killed in a riding accident on the grounds. Another one became a caretaker later and eventually plugged his finger into a light socket by mistake. So I guess you would call this all verification of a curse, that there is a curse between the hotel and the caretakers. There's a shared kind of a process that's happening there. The next point of interest that I'll discuss is on page 78. There is no alcohol in the hotel. This is specifically stated by Mr. Halloran, that they've cleaned the place out the previous night after everybody kind of had their end of the year party. So they're all done with that. So when we see the bartender and everything else, we know now it's either manifested by the hotel itself or it's manifested by Jack Torrance, because it's clean. Bottom of page 78. We're introduced to a character, Sally, who is apparently an attractive maid. She tells Mr. Halloran that his car is ready to go. And as he turns to the Torrances, and she strolls away with her backside twitching pertly. Those are the words that are mentioned. So there again is another kind of a sexual attraction thing that's happening. And we have to note, of course, that Mr. Halloran has been, he's been professional in his behavior. So although he gives her a kiss on the forehead, it is not what I would consider to be sexually aggressive at all. And in spite of the fact that she's quite attractive, and he even mentions that he heard that she's going to get married. So she's off to go get married, and he treats her well. So in the film, later on, he'll be shown in his room, his hotel room in Florida, with pictures of women, but he seems to be totally under control here. So I don't get that. I'm just making a note of it here, that I don't know what to make of Mr. Halloran. You know, is he someone who is kind of sexually active or not? Right? I mean, he's not a married man. He's an older man. He's not married. Why not? Okay, let's look on page... The next point is actually chapter 11. Okay, so this is a really big chapter, and there's a lot of really big points to discuss here. So let's look at page 81. Now, at this point, Mr. Halloran is discussing things with Danny in his car before he leaves to Miami. This is not in the film at all. Instead, this is kind of a mental conversation that's happening in the film between Danny while they're just kind of hanging out in the kitchen. And of course, while he's giving Danny some ice cream. But in the film, they have this separately in the car before Mr. Halloran leaves. And while Wendy is watching, she's watching from a distance. Okay? So Mr. Halloran acknowledges that that Danny Torrance has a shining. Wendy watches on, and she notices that Danny is utterly and completely fascinated with the discussion that he's locked in on Mr. Halloran, which she's seen him do before with television. I don't know what I've heard different terms for this. I don't know what to call it, but I know that some people they fixate on things of keen interest. They'll drop the whole facade of not being locked in on things. They'll be totally focused on things. Some people call it the INFJ stare or something like that, or some people will call it the male stare when they're dealing with like inappropriate and inferred sexual stare. But there are people that will, when they're completely interested, will lock in visually on things, and that can be unnerving to some folks. The bottom of page 81, we find out that there are different types of shine. Some people don't really know what they're doing. Again, now, this would be like the opposite of the shadow that we represented with Jung, that people don't want to confront the shadow. Well, some people don't want to understand or embrace the idea of shining. So, in the same way that people are blind to their own shadows, they can be blind to their own ability to shine. That process. He kind of indicates that as people just kind of showing up with flowers for people on the right day somehow. Or maybe they do good on tests they don't even study for, or they got a good idea about something. So some people have that ability to shine, but they don't really develop it. They don't really understand what they're doing. Let's continue on. Page 83. This is a very important point. Just after Danny has tried to send a message for practice to Mr. Halloran, they begin to talk about baseball. So Danny says he sent this message like he was Nolan Ryan throwing a fastball. And Mr. Halloran asks him, you like baseball? And Danny says, yeah, him and his dad do, and they like the Angels. Interesting choice of team there, the Angels, of course. But they like the Red Sox and the Reds, okay? Or they also like the Red Sox, and they saw the Red Sox versus the Reds in the World Series. I believe that was in 1975. At any rate, the point I'm bringing up baseball is because that's in the film. And it's not only in this film, all right? So we have the scenes in the film that I'll point to is when Jack is throwing the ball against the wall, and that's a very similar scene to another movie, and I'll discuss that when I get to the movie. But the most important thing is obviously the baseball bat. So there is a baseball bat in the film, and we just discussed Hercules. Okay, we just discussed some of these ideas. There's a roque mallet, but there's no roque mallet in the film. What is there? There's a baseball bat. Why is there a baseball bat? Because it's American. It is an American version of the myth of Hercules. And the difference is, of course, that Wendy Torrance is the one wielding the baseball bat. Not Hercules, not a male. She's female, and she's wielding the baseball bat. So that is an issue of importance. And, of course, Jack Torrance is shown with the ball. Okay, I'll discuss that later when I get to our scene, because our scene is going to have the baseball bat in it. The next point is on page 83. We find out that Danny kind of sucks his thumb because he's thinking of the dark thoughts that surround his own father. This will be consistent kind of with the film. When something is kind of going on that's dark or disturbs Danny, he has a tendency to suck his thumb. It would be interesting to see if he always is sucking his thumb when he's thinking about his father, or if it's just in general. I don't know. Okay, let's continue on. We'll look at the bottom of page 83, and I'm reworking this particular point because I did a bad job of explaining it previously. So at the bottom of page 83, we have a very, very important point, and this is one of the most important points I'll make in this episode. It's one of the top three. Halloran is talking with Danny, and he asks him, does he kind of know what his parents are thinking? And Danny says that he usually does, but he doesn't usually try. And Halloran says, why don't you try? Or why not? And Danny responds, troubled for a moment, that it's kind of inappropriate. It's kind of like looking in the bedroom and watching while his parents are busy doing the thing that makes babies. So that's his exact word, the thing that makes babies. So this is an obvious reference to intercourse. Halloran states, Danny then asks him if he knows that thing, and then Halloran states to him he does have an acquaintance to it, or he is aware of it, and he states so gravely. Why? First, let's make one point. Halloran now has displayed two moral, ethical actions that prove that he is basically a good person. The first was the maid that came up to him and let him know his car was ready. He gave her a kiss on the forehead, and he kind of congratulated her on her upcoming wedding, and he turned away as she walked away, and he did not stare at her, quote, perky bottom or whatever it was. The second is here now. He is concerned that Danny is aware of something that he has no business being aware of. And immediately Halloran recognizes this as something dangerous because it will cause potentially fear and anxiety in Danny. He will not understand the process. He will not understand what is happening. And it could very easily be misinterpreted by a child. He understands that and he is concerned. So previously we've discussed this very interaction. And I mentioned that this is tied to Snow White and this is tied to the Dopey sticker. And I'm going to prove it to you right now. So let's consider the movie Snow White. Dopey, who is not a dwarf, he does not have a beard like the other dwarves, and he is still around the same height as them, which should already kind of pique your interest, is sent up by the other dwarves, with a candle, by the way, to shed light on something, to find out what's going on upstairs, because they know someone has been in their cottage, and they want to find out what's going on. Some of the animals are making noise by the roof, so they assume there's something going on upstairs. So he goes up to examine and find out what's going on. When he gets up there, there's someone under the sheets groaning and making noises. Now, this is an obvious correlation to what we just found out, although it's just one person. I will further explain this dynamic later on when I'm discussing the film. But for now, it should be clear to you that these are all connected. This idea of Danny considering the thing that makes babies, his mother resembling Snow White moaning under the sheets, and the Dopey sticker, because Dopey is scared by what he is seeing, by what's happening. They're all related. Okay, on the next page, 84, he tells Mr. Halloran about his friend Tony and how he sometimes dreams when he's awake. And he wanted to have his thumb go in his mouth again. So for some reason, he's making that association. We have here something that's not particularly disturbing, but perhaps it is to Danny Torrance, that he's having visions and interactions with his friend, and it triggers his thumb sucking. So although this isn't directly related with his parents, it is an example of him being stressed and regressing to childhood behavior. So on page 85, Mr. Halloran is discussing things with Danny, and again Danny has the urge to suck his thumb because they're discussing his father getting drunk and doing bad and being bad, that it was a bad thing to do to get drunk. And Mr. Halloran tells Danny that what he has is kind of a shine. He calls it a shining, and in the Bible, they called it having visions. So he sees things. He refers directly to the Bible there. So there's a direct Christian reference tied to the idea of shining. So our symbol review tied to Christianity is accurate. It's relayed right there in the identification with Mr. Holleran, stating that as a practitioner of the shining, it is tied to Christianity in some way, or to, let's say, spirituality or religion at least. Okay, on page 86, we find out that Mr. Holleran relays his ability to the scent of oranges. It seems to be something that happens to him. On page 86 here, he discusses some things do and some things don't come true. It doesn't have anything to do with shining. It's just the nature of things. So basically he says he made all these changes and nothing happened. So although you can have visions, it doesn't mean that they are definitely going to occur. And that's just his advice to Danny. On page 87, he specifically tells Danny to stay away from room 217. Stay away from it all winter long. And of course, Danny does not do so. On page 88. Okay, so this is a very important page, and this is where I'll end for now. We find out a number of things. Mr. Holleran specifically says two things that I think are noteworthy. The first is that if you see something, you can just look away. And this is what Danny does in the hallway. And he specifically says, in a hallway or a room outside by the hedges or anything, just look away, and when you look back, it'll be gone. Okay? And Danny says, okay. The next thing that's very important is that Holleran admits that he was testing Danny's parents. And he says that his mom kind of jumped a little bit when he kind of nudged her with his brain. So obviously he sent her a telepathic message to see what would happen. And she jumped a little bit. And right here, he states that all mothers shine a little bit, at least until their kids grow up. Okay, so, and he also mentions his dad. So really quickly, his dad, he says he kind of pushed him, and he felt like something was there, or it really, really wasn't there. As if Jack had something that he was hiding. Okay, so the idea there that Jack is hiding things is again tied to darkness. It's tied to the shadow. So from a Jungian point of view, Jack is associated with shadow. From a spiritual point of view, Jack is associated with the shadow. It's consuming him. And either way you want to look at it, from those 2 points of view, he's being consumed by the shadow. That's acknowledged by Holleran in that statement. Now let's look really quickly at the last thing that I would like to discuss. He says, Mr. Holleran says that mothers shine. Okay, he says, I think all mothers shine. Why? Why does he think all mothers shine? He doesn't say all women. He says all mothers. Well, a mother is someone who's given birth. And as we have mentioned with the numbers, the process of giving birth is the process of giving life to a child. So if you believe in this process of birth, rebirth, death, rebirth, etc., participating in that process is innately shining in a way. Okay? So let's look at a few hints before I get into this too much. I want to discuss 2 things. One is the idea of red rum. Okay, so red rum, we assume, it's a statement that is tied to, and we've already discussed red rum is in one of Danny's dreams or visions. It's a reflection of the word murder. Okay, but is it a reflection of the process of murder? What is murder? Murder is taking something alive and making it dead in a cruel way. So what is the reflection of that? The reflection of that would be taking something that's dead and making it alive. That would be the reflection. The inverse of murder would be red rum. And that is what, if you believe in the process of the spirit or the travel of a soul, if you believe that people have souls, then that, and that we contain light within us, that is what happens when we're born. We are taken in a caring way from non-existence into existence. That is red rum. That process then of nothingness to somethingness is perhaps what's happening here in the hotel. Perhaps that's what's happening with Danny, that he's manifesting these things. Perhaps the whole family is manifesting these things in the hotel through this ability to shine or to be consumed with shadow. Difficult to know for sure. Now, one of the things that I want to point out really quickly before I move on is an idea that's also called out by Jung. And although he obviously has the idea of the shadow, which is I think, fairly well known, the idea, and there is Academy of Ideas. They do how to integrate the shadow and other things. I really like Academy of Ideas. No affiliation. I'll link their video. You can check them out if you like. They're really good. But one of the Jungian concepts to be discussed is the anima and the animus. Okay? Now, we've already discussed how Wendy seems to be kind of both female and male. She's wearing the red and the blue dress. She's doing work in the film. And she's performing self-review here in the novel to some degree. So she seems to be developing over time. Now, one of the things that is important with the anima and the animus is that these kind of are tied to the idea of someone becoming a whole person by embracing aspects of the other side within them. So, in a way, a man would learn how to integrate the feminine side of himself in order to become a full person. And this also shows in how they relate to women. And this relation to women is called out by Jung in a stage of four steps of development. And he calls these stages Eve, Helen, Mary, and Sophia. So it starts out with Eve, where the male views women basically as the emergence of desire, and tied up with the idea of the woman providing nourishment, security, and love, like a mother. Okay, you can go read about. I'll put them up here on the screen for you to consider. Notice that the last step is Sophia, which has to do with wise and fully human. Now, Sophia, of course, is important to Gnostics. That's the point, is the development of wisdom. And this is the fourth and last stage. And at this stage, eventually, the person is able to relate to women as individuals. So the importance of this process, of this review, is to eventually get to a point where a person is completely individual. They are completely unique within themselves and self-assured. They understand who they are. Now, this development of anima or animus, depending on male versus female, has to do with the idea of someone eventually becoming wholly whoever they are. To what degree they are male or female is not necessarily important. What is important is that they've gone through this process, they recognize who they are, and they become whole, a whole person that is self-realized. And of course, this will have light and dark, or positive and negative elements throughout. And if this process is completed, it can make someone. It can provide creativity to a person. It can provide spirituality to a person, life-giving affirmation to a person. And if it's not performed properly, it can cause petrification within a person, and they can stagnate. And that's kind of the process that I see happening to the two characters in the film. Wendy Torrance is self-reviewing, and she's becoming whole over time. She's embracing both her femininity and her masculinity. And Jack Torrance is stagnating and petrifying. He's refusing to develop through the film. And we'll see this in the scene that I'm going to discuss now from the 3 points of view. We're going to look at it from a psychological point of view. We'll look at it from a traditional Christian point of view. And we'll look at it from what I consider to be kind of a Gnostic / mythological point of view. So let's get started.
do you like it? How do you like it? What are you doing down here?
I just wanted to talk to you.
Okay, let's talk. What should be done with him?
I don't know.
I don't think that's true. I think you have some very definite ideas about what should be done with Danny, and I'd like to know what they are. When do you think maybe he should be taken to a doctor?
As soon as possible.
As soon as possible. And are you concerned about me?
Of course I am.
Of course you are. Ever thought about my responsibilities?
Oh, Dick, what are you talking about?
Have you ever had a single moment's thought about my responsibilities? Have you ever thought for a single solitary moment about my responsibilities to my employers? Has it ever occurred to you that I have agreed to look after the Overlook Hotel until May the 1st? Does it matter to you at all that the owners have placed their complete confidence and trust in me, and that I have signed a letter of agreement, a contract? Responsibilities? Has it ever occurred to you? Has it?
Stay away from me.
Why?
I just want to go back to my room.
Why?
Well, I'm very confused. I just need a chance to think things over.
You've had your whole fucking life to think things over. Light of my life.
Don't hurt me.
I'm not gonna hurt you.
Don't hurt me.
Give me the bat.
Please. Billy.
Give me the bat.
Stop it.
Give me the bat.
Billy.
Stop swinging the bat.
Please stop.
Give me the bat.
Billy.
Wendy.
Stop.
Give me the bat. Give me the bat. Ah, God damn.
Okay, so let's take a look at our scene from a psychological point of view.
How do you like it? How do you like it? What are you doing down here?
I just wanted to talk to you.
Okay, let's talk. What should be done with him?
I don't know.
I don't think that's true. I think you have some very definite ideas about what should be done with Danny, and I'd like to know what they are. When do you think maybe he should be taken to a doctor?
As soon as possible.
As soon as possible. Are you concerned about me?
Of course I am.
Of course you are. Ever thought about my responsibilities?
Oh, Dick, what are you talking about?
Have you ever had a single moment's thought about my responsibilities? Have you ever thought for a single solitary moment about my responsibilities to my employers? Has it ever occurred to you that I have agreed to look after the Overlook Hotel until May the 1st? Does it matter to you at all that the owners have placed their complete confidence and trust in me and that I have signed a letter of agreement, a contract? Responsibilities? Has it ever occurred to you? Has it?
Stay away from me.
Why?
I just want to go back to my room.
Why?
Well, I'm very confused. I just need a chance to think things over.
You've had your whole fucking life to think things over. Light of my life.
Don't hurt me.
I'm not gonna hurt you.
Stay away from me.
Give me the bat.
Please. Get away.
Give me the bat.
Stop it.
Give me the bat.
Stay away.
Stop swinging the bat.
Please stop.
Give me the bat.
Stay away.
Wendy.
Stay.
Give me the bat. Give me the bat. Ah, God damn.
In the second version, we'll discuss what I consider to be an Orthodox Christian point of view.
How do you like it? How do you like it? What are you doing down here?
I just wanted to talk to you.
Okay, let's talk. What should be done with him?
I don't know.
I don't think that's true. I think you have some very definite ideas about what should be done with Danny, and I'd like to know what they are. When do you think maybe he should be taken to a doctor?
As soon as possible.
As soon as possible. And are you concerned about me?
Of course I am.
Of course you are. Ever thought about my responsibilities?
Oh, Dick, what are you talking about?
Have you ever had a single moment's thought about my responsibilities? Have you ever thought for a single solitary moment about my responsibilities to my employers? Has it ever occurred to you that I have agreed to look after the Overlook Hotel until May the 1st? Does it matter to you at all that the owners have placed their complete confidence and trust in me and that I have signed a letter of agreement, a contract? Responsibilities? Has it ever occurred to you? Has it?
Stay away from me.
Why?
I just want to go back to my room.
Why?
Well, I'm very confused. I just need a chance to think things over.
You've had your whole fucking life to think things over. Light of my life.
Don't hurt me.
I'm not gonna hurt you.
Don't hurt me.
Give me the bat.
Please. Please.
Give me the bat.
Stop it.
Give me the bat.
Please.
Stop swinging the bat.
Please stop.
Give me the bat.
Please.
Wendy. Give me the bat. Give me the bat. Ah, God damn.
In our third review of the scene, we'll take a look at it from what I consider to be a Gnostic Christian / Kabbalistic / mythological point of view.
How do you like it? How do you like it? What are you doing down here?
I just wanted to talk to you.
Okay. Let's talk. What should be done with him?
I don't know.
I don't think that's true. I think you have some very definite ideas about what should be done with Danny, and I'd like to know what they are. When do you think maybe he should be taken to a doctor?
As soon as possible.
As soon as possible. And are you concerned about me?
Of course I am.
Of course you are. Ever thought about my responsibilities?
Oh, Dick, what are you talking about?
Have you ever had a single moment's thought about my responsibilities? Have you ever thought for a single solitary moment about my responsibilities to my employers? Has it ever occurred to you that I have agreed to look after the Overlook Hotel until May the 1st? Does it matter to you at all that the owners have placed their complete confidence and trust in me and that I have signed a letter of agreement, a contract? Responsibilities? Has it ever occurred to you? Has it?
Stay away from me.
Why?
I just want to go back to my room.
Why?
Well, I'm very confused. I just need a chance to think things over.
You've had your whole fucking life to think things over. Light of my life.
Don't hurt me.
I'm not gonna hurt you.
Don't hurt me.
Give me the bat.
Please. Please.
Give me the bat.
Stop it.
Give me the bat.
Please.
Stop swinging the bat.
Please stop.
Give me the bat.
Please.
Wendy.
Please.
Give me the bat. Give me the bat. Ah, God damn.
And that's pretty much it. I hope you guys really enjoyed this video. Hit me with comments and questions. I hope that my thoughts were easily followed. I don't pretend to be an expert in any of these topics, so I'm sure there'll be a lot of comments. And like I said, I'm not a psychologist. I'm just throwing some psychology terms in there and trying to look at it from that point of view as best I can. And I do consider myself to be a Christian, though I don't really consider myself to be
fully orthodox or Gnostic. I just think that they're interesting points of view to consider. So that's pretty much it. These videos are not easy to make. Some people have subscribed. I hope this is enjoyable, and I'm going to continue on with the book discussion as we go. I really don't know how much time this is going to take, but so long as people are checking in and enjoying the videos, I'll keep going. All for now. Take care.